That matter will be taken up by the NCLT tomorrow. Will it fly or not? Experts remain skeptical. Now on to our Teachers' Day special. Broadcast journalism has transformed over the years, and so today on CNBC TV18, we invited two television broadcast pioneers, Usha Albuquerque and Rini Khanna. They are, of course, veterans of the television news industry, starting their careers on Doordarshan, where they were for almost 2 decades. Here's my special interaction with them on the do's and don'ts of broadcast journalism. We're celebrating Teachers' Day, and in case you missed the beginning of this show, let me introduce our very special guests tonight, two of television broadcast industry's veterans who've pretty much written the book on what television news is all about. Usha Albuquerque and Rini Khanna, who've spent many years on Doordarshan broadcasting live every single day. Well, Usha, let me ask you, what was it like? You anchored for DD for about 20 years. This was live news. You started in the black and white era and then moved to the color era. What was it like in those days?
You know, when I see today what's happening, and you've got so many cameras and gizmos and all kinds of equipment, and I think of the days when we started with black and white, it was just one page that came to you, and you pretty much read it and looked up, and you had
to keep... Did you have to memorize it?
Not quite. The pages were there, but there were many people who thought we'd memorized it, and there were very many people who even asked me, "Aapka bhashan bahut acha hai." You know, they actually thought we were giving speeches. But now, when I see the equipment that is available, I think it's a huge, step forward, and I think it's wonderful. But in those days, it was difficult. We had just the one camera. We had just the one computer. So once the news started, they couldn't add or subtract anything. So we got messages, or we got sheets of paper.
Chits were handed over to you, or were instructions in your ear?
Instructions were being given, and what to stop at and what not to do. And there was very little video footage. So it was pretty much us giving out the news and the headlines and everything else.
So, Rini, let me ask you, I mean, was there any training that you got before you actually started? What was that era like of broadcasting live on Doordarshan?
Well, when you look back today, you wonder how you did it, because you had, like Usha said, you had very little to work with. These are days when you didn't have the teleprompter, and so you relied on your own knowledge of what was going on, as well as the sheets that came in fresh from the oven. You never even got a chance sometimes to read those sheets beforehand, so you had to improvise and go with the flow. You also didn't have instructions being given to you through a little earphone. You had instructions being given to you by mime, with your camera person standing behind the camera and trying to help you as you go along. Or the floor manager. You had somebody called the floor manager who would give you some signals, and then you had to interpret and make sure that you didn't show anything on your face, but you did it like it was, a duck taking to water. So yes, very exciting, but lots of room for disasters to happen. And you were pretty much the person who had to
what was the worst disaster?
And make sure everything went
well. What was the worst disaster that you had to live through?
Well, it was pretty much jumping into the water without knowing whether you can swim or not. So there were lots of disasters that could occur, but I think most of us managed because we were good at doing what we were doing. A lot of us were journalists who had been trained. We never got training to read the news, but you were trained in the medium, so you did understand what was happening and how to skirt a certain issue. The disasters would be only technical errors that you had to manage at your end without knowing whether they were manageable or not. Because very often, like Usha said, you had very little video. And sometimes the video came on without an audio, and you didn't know whether the audio had gone on or not. And you only had a certain, sheet of paper to work with, and you couldn't invent the news. So you had to pretty much, go by what was going on the floor.
Yes.
I can imagine what that was like.
In fact, I know there was a time in which I got a blank page There was,
You got a blank page.
It was absolutely blank because what needed to be said had to be changed, and the editor hadn't been able to scribble it quickly enough. So I finished with one news item, and I'm waiting for the next one to come.
So what did you do?
And I had to keep looking up and saying, I'm sorry, I beg your pardon, and hope something would happen.
Also,
that placard didn't come up, is it?
No,
also,
it didn't come up.
Shereen,
But,
yeah,
you know,
also, Shereen, you have to understand that those days...
Yes, Rini.
Sorry. Also, you have to understand that those days we didn't have computers. They were being actually typed on a typewriter. So you had a sheet that came to you, and you had a carbon copy that remained with the editor. So you would pretty much go with your copy, and sometimes there would be errors in the typing. There would be typos. So for instance, you had a line like, police were combing the operation,
grammatical mistakes.
and the C got replaced by B. So it would read as, police were bombing the operation. And you had to have the presence of mind to correct yourself immediately and not wait for somebody to tell you, oh, you read it wrong.
Absolutely.
But, you know, this was not the era of breaking news every minute. I mean, today we live in an era of breaking news practically every second, forget every minute. But, you know, were there instances where you had to deal with news on the fly?
There was, when something...
Yes.
You know, really disaster happened. Like, I remember I was on news when Operation Blue Star happened. And that was really, you know, bit by bit. And, you know, we were literally getting line by line to speak on the... And, you know, the visuals were hard to come by. But that was one incident I remember. But by and large, you know, it was news that had happened. And whatever video was available, they would add that on and then, you know, give us the news bulletin along with it. But I don't think it was as sensational as it is made out today.
You
today,
think TV news is sensational today?
Oh, too much, too much. I mean, everything is not necessarily breaking news.
Yes.
So, but every news channel wants... Firstly, okay, that's the other thing. We were the only news channel.
Yeah.
So there was no competition. Everybody would watch us. So there was no need to necessarily sensationalize things to make it more attractive. Everybody did watch it. So it was more to make it credible
but I think...
rather than sensational.
Okay, Rini, what do you... Yeah,
I think,
go
Shereen,
ahead.
there is that responsibility that comes with being the only news channel. So, for instance, you know, the breaking news like, say, Mrs. Gandhi's death or Rajiv Gandhi's assassination, all these things would be, you know, dealt with in a very somber and dignified manner, and it wouldn't be sensationalized, yet there would be a responsible reportage that would be attached to news of that kind. And very often you would get called at the last minute because somebody was not available or some disaster happened, and you were called in. So you didn't have the time to go through what had gone through the entire day. You were just handed the news really hot off the oven.
For people who are looking at getting into the broadcast journalism space, specifically people with aspirations of wanting to be TV anchors, what are the do's and don'ts?
Lots of do's and don'ts. Lots of don'ts. I think television today is marred by the fact that people are shouting at each other. I think that needs to be toned down. You can talk into a camera and into a microphone without having to shout. The other do's are that you need to do your homework, you need to know what you're talking about, you need to get pronunciations right. There's a huge world out there which you don't know how to pronounce, and perhaps you should do your homework in finding out how the natives pronounce those words. As far as you know, being a journalist today on television, well, it's a huge responsibility. And, you know, from my days when you were a specialist in doing what you were doing, to today when you are not just the anchor, you're the producer, you're a camera person, you're a reporter, you're doing so many roles all in one. I think you need to be very, very sure that you want to be in this field and give it your all.
That's right. Well, Usha,
yes, I think I agree with Rini on several of those counts, but I'll also say a lot of the young people who want to be on television, because I deal with them. In fact, I had thought, being Teachers' Day, you're going to ask me about the education area, in which, because I deal with students and teachers a lot, and many of them want to be anchors, or at least in front of a camera.
Yeah.
But they don't understand.
Yes.
Firstly, a lot of them don't even read news.
Yes.
So I think that's something that is very important. You need to be aware of what's happening. You need to be in tune with what you... and have the capacity to analyze, to understand, to appreciate, be objective. And I think, knowledgeable about what you're going to say. And of course, like Rini said, make quite sure that you get your pronunciation correct and the intonation of what you want to say. And yes, that pretty much covers a lot of what we want to do today. But I would say that I think a number of things like interviews, which I think we should have done at that time.
Right.
We didn't do.
Yes.
And I missed that because I was very much part of the news, and I still am in terms of my interest in news and what's happening in the current affairs. And I feel that that's something that could have been added on earlier.
That's right. And that was a missed opportunity during the DD days.
No, but not that I would want to come back on. I think there are lots of young people that are doing a far better job. And like you, as I would like to hold you as an example, which I do, Shereen. I must tell you that because you come from a background in which you didn't really do media, and you got into media. And I always use that as an example for young people who don't know what subjects to take on, what to study, and still want to get into media. And I say, look at Shereen, she's doing so fantastically well.
Thank you so much. That's very kind of you. Appreciate it. Thank you for this masterclass, and thank you for everything that you do. Rini, Simon, Khanna, and Usha Albuquerque, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for joining us here.